No one knows the source of this quote, but it is definitely a good one, which says that overconfidence coupled with negligence can lead to sad consequences. Again, the source is unknown there, but it's a good sentence. That overconfidence coupled with negligence can lead to sad consequences. And I think a story that relates that very well is a man by the name of Bobby Leach. You've probably never heard of Bobby Leach. But if you lived about 100 years or so ago, Bobby Leach would be a name that you would know. Bobby Leach had a restaurant around the Buffalo, New York area, and around 1901, there was a woman by the name of Annie Taylor. And Annie Taylor was a 63-year-old teacher who wasn't doing so well financially and decided to gain fame and fortune. She lowered herself into a barrel, took her cat, and had a rowboat pull her in that barrel into the Niagara River, cut the rope, and Annie Taylor became the first person and woman ever to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. She went over and she came out with it, her and her cat came out without a scratch except for the scratch she got on the barrel as she got out. Now, Annie became instantly famous, though she wasn't able to turn that fame into money. Well, this man by the name of Bobby Leach saw that. And Bobby had been in the Barnum Bailey Circus, and Bobby began exclaiming, anything that Annie can do, I can do better. Anything that Annie can do, I can do better. So over the course of time, Bobby built a metal barrel, huge long metal barrel. When Lisa and I had went to Niagara Falls, we went through the thing there, the little museum they got, and saw the picture. I think they even had the barrel there, this metal barrel. And 10 years later, Bobby goes over Niagara Falls in that metal barrel. Now he didn't do it better in one sense. He came out with fractures and contusions and spent the next 6 months in the hospital. But whereas Annie had gained fame, so did Bobby. But Bobby also gained money. He would go to the vaudeville acts in different places and tell his story and get paid for us. You say, well, what's this got to do with overconfidence coupled with negligence? Well, let me tell you how Bobby died. It was 15 years later, and Bobby was in New Zealand. And he was in New Zealand touting his great feats of going over Niagara Falls. The first man ever to do it. As Bobby was walking, he slipped on an orange peel. He fell, and he broke his leg. Went to the hospital, and he died from complications of a broken leg. You see, Bobby was prepared for Niagara Falls. But Bobby was not prepared for danger in what he assumed to be a safe situation. Our text today helps us to get prepared for crisis and for things that may not seem to be a safe situation. In fact, we're continuing what we began last week, where this section deals with faithfulness in discipleship, part 2. In fact, I think next week will probably be part 3. But we're dealing with faithfulness in discipleship. This whole last section, this passion section of Mark, deals with how do we remain faithful to Christ as a disciple. If we call ourselves a follower of Jesus Christ, how do we do so, especially in times of crisis? Especially when those times of crisis come. Now I want to review, because what we looked at last week builds upon what we're going to be looking at today. Last week when we looked at our text from last week in verses 12 through 31, we found that faithfulness in discipleship is grounded in 3 things. We found that it's grounded in God's sovereign control over all that transpires. That God is in control. What is going on in your life right now is going on in your life because God is in control. Situations that are occurring in your life, though it may seem like God is nowhere to be found, God is in control. And no matter where you're at right now, God is in control of all that's transpiring in your life. He is sovereign. And if we're going to be faithful in discipleship, we have to recognize that fact and come to grips with that God is in control. And God allows things into our lives. And when He allows those things into our lives, it's not for our hurt, it's not for our ruin, but it's to form us and to shape us into the character and to the image of His Son. We found also that it's grounded in God's situational context. And we found that situational context was this, is that glory through suffering. Glory is going to occur. Glory is going to happen. But the only way that you receive glory is through suffering. You cannot reach glory by bypassing suffering. And we found that. And lastly, we found that it's not grounded in godless self-confidence. And really our text today kind of unpacks some of that point right there. It's kind of an addendum to it. It kind of adds to it in this matter as it relates to self-confidence. And it's important as we look at this story that we saw last week that because of Christ's faithful discipleship to the Father, that you and I can be faithful disciples. What is it? What will cause us to become faithful disciples? Is it stuffing our head with all the knowledge that we need? Is it going about doing all kinds of good works? What is it that can cause us to be faithful disciples of Christ? We have to recognize that Christ not only died for us, but Christ also lived for us. And because He lived in a way that you and I could never live, and because we are in Him, that what He accomplished in His life, we can accomplish in our lives. Not because we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. I've lost a lot of my Hebrew. Now, I'm not talking about lost in the Jewish guy. I mean, I've lost a lot of the language of Hebrew. And I spent at DTS $5,000 to learn that language. And I thought, dadgum, I'm so cheap. I thought, I am not going to spend $5,000 just to know a Hebrew alphabet. That's what I'm doing. I'm going back and I'm going through and relearning it and stuff like that. And one of the instructors from one of the videos that I'm watching calls this one thing, the stuff I'm going through right now, you just got to memorize it. And he calls it sola bootstrappa. The solas are like grace, sola sola scriptura, by the scriptures alone, by grace alone, through Christ alone. And then he says sola bootstrappa. In other words, you got to just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and memorize it. There's no easy way. You just got to memorize it. You got to do the work. When it comes to our Christian walk, there is no sola bootstrappa. You just can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You have to recognize that we can do this. And as we saw last week, and as we'll see when we get to the end of the Gospel of Mark, we can always go back to God. And we'll talk more about that. We'll talk more about that next time. I want us to begin, again, as we're going through this background, I want us to go back to Mark 13 and verse 35. Because this helps us to understand what's going on. In Mark 13:35, if you remember, Jesus is talking here, and he says, he's talking to certain of his disciples, and he says to them, "Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning." If you remember, when we dealt with this passage, we said that Mark's gospel is going to take us into those 4 different times. Now again, the evening, when they would say the evening would be from about 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. The midnight would be, and those terms there are terms that really describe the end of these 3-hour time periods, how the night was divided by the Romans. The midnight would go from 9 to 12, the rooster crowing from 12 to 3, and then the morning from 3 to 6. But in those 4 time periods, those 4 watches of the night of the Romans, Jesus is telling the 4, but it goes beyond the 4 there. He tells them, stay alert. Stay alert. I want you to stay alert so that you can be faithful. because you don't know. You don't know when crisis times are going to come. They can come in the evening, at midnight, in the morning, and when the rooster crows. And Mark is using that. This verse is a key pivotal verse because throughout the rest of the book, Mark takes us through each of those 4 times, and in each of those 4 times, we see Jesus being faithful in his discipleship to God, and the disciples blowing it. Blowing it. Last time, we looked at in the evening, which was, again, remember chapter 14 and verse 17 of Mark's Gospel. It says, and when it was evening, he came with the 12, and as they were reclining at table eating, Jesus said to them, and one of you going to betray me? Who is it? Who is it? I don't know. Who is it? We find that Judas is going to betray him. They all make the statement that we're going to be with you, that we're going to stay with you. And now we're getting into the midnight time. And I've got the question mark by the 3 hours, because probably Jesus left, they left the Lord's table as they're celebrating the Passover. They probably left around about 9 o'clock. And we know that there's probably a 3-hour period in the garden, because Jesus goes to pray, and then he comes back to Peter, and he says, could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Now, I don't think it's possible that Jesus is using hyperbole here. But it's also probably much more, I think at least as far as the rhetorical aspect and what Mark is trying to get across here, that he's referring to a literal hour. Could you not pray with me for 1 hour? Now, it's from 9 to 10, if that first hour is correct. Now, I don't know about you, but I found, last night, Lisa said, you want to go to the gym. And about 8 o'clock, it's like 5 till 8, I was feeling great. And about 8 o'clock, and she asked me about 8:05. I said, I ain't going. I'm just not going to forget that. And so, it just, boom! So I can understand why these guys are tired from 9 to 10. And then Jesus comes back to the second time and says the same thing. So it's probably about a 3-hour period here. Jesus is probably in the garden from about 9 o'clock to midnight, and the betrayal and his arrest takes place around midnight. So here we are. Again, there's nothing that talks about the midnight time here in this section. But if you take those 3 hours, if those are literally 3 hours that Jesus is talking about here, then we're here in this midnight section where once again the disciples fail, but Jesus doesn't. Now, there's something else in Mark's story that I want you to get across, because Mark is very clear when he comes. When the text starts off there in verse 33, and he took with him Peter and James and John. Why? Why did he take Peter, James, and John? You've probably heard that this was the inner circle and so forth, and I'm not sure how everybody relates to that. But throughout Mark's Gospel, Peter and James and John have been witnesses to Jesus' unique relationship with God. Now just park on that for just a second. And as we go through this, these guys should have been more prepared than anybody else to stand with Jesus at his most crucial moment. Now think about that. The first time we see Peter, James, and John is in Mark chapter 5, verses 37 through 43. We've got it up there for you, and we'll go through it. And it says, and he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. Remember, this is when Jesus is on his way. Jairus comes to him and says, my daughter is sick, and she needs to be healed. And as Jesus is making his way to this 12-year-old girl, there's a woman who's had an issue of blood for 12 years. And she touches Jesus' garment, and Jesus recognizes that power has flown out from him. And he stops the crowd and stops the procession and talks to this woman. And this woman is healed and comes to faith. And because of that delay, somebody comes and says, don't worry the master anymore. She's dead. She's dead. And Jesus tells them, listen, don't let that stop you. Don't let this situation stop you. And he goes, and when he gets to the house, he finds all these people mourning and weeping over the loss of this 12-year-old girl. And then Jesus takes the parents, and he takes Peter, James, and John with him into this little girl's room where he's about to do something. And Jesus saw the commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put all of them outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumai, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking. For she was 12 years of age, and they, who's the they? Who's the they? Peter, James, John, the mother, and the father. Now, eventually the whole crowd. But the first people that were amazed is Peter, James, and John, the mother and the father. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this. He told them to give her something to eat. Now, what were they to take away from that? Peter, James, and John. I mean, here is this girl who's dead. Who's dead? But he takes those three in there with him. And they should have, what they should have remembered is, our master can make the dead alive. And if we follow Jesus, even to the death, that doesn't matter. Because he can resurrect us. He can resurrect us. Listen, what? Jackie's always been known for driving fast. What kind of driver would Jackie really be if he knew that if he was driving and got killed in an accident, it didn't matter? He'd be able to walk out of that thing scratch-free and drive just as fast as he wanted to again. Amen, Jackie?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, just think about it. I mean, think of how heroic we could become. We see somebody robbing a grocery store, we can just walk right in there, you know, and stop. They shoot us, and we die. We just jump right back up. Ladies, your husbands would never die. You know? That may not be a good thing for you. Might not be a bad thing for you. I don't know. You can never get rid of them. But all this, and they should have taken away from that and realized it. Listen, our master has power over death. Over death. The Transfiguration. Chapter 9. Again, all this is in Mark. Chapter 9, verses 2 through 13. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say. Terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Shut up! Listen to what he's got to say. Follow what he has to say. Obey what he has to say. And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen. Second time. Don't tell anybody about this girl rising. Don't tell anybody about my transfiguration until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead might mean. They asked him, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he said to them, Elijah does come first to restore all things. And how is it written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written of him. The Transfiguration. What happened at the Transfiguration? They saw the glory of Christ, and Christ talks to them about his death, but that his death will lead to glory. When Jesus is talking to the 12 about, if you suffer with me, you'll receive glory. Peter, James, and John saw what that glory looked like. Peter, James, and John experienced it to such an effect that when they saw it, they were so dumbfounded, they didn't know what to say. Peter says, let's build a tabernacle here, because he thinks he's got to say something. And the Father says, shut up and listen to what Jesus has to say. They knew. They knew what the glory looked like. They knew what it was like on the other side. They saw what suffering, when suffering leads to glory, how that glory is unpacked. So they saw it. So that when Jesus talked to them about suffering always precedes glory, they should have recognized that whatever suffering we endure, whatever suffering we have to go through, is nothing compared to the glory that awaits us. Also, it's Peter, James, and John that assert their willingness to suffer. That assert their willingness to suffer. Jesus said to them that then there is James and John. Remember James and John in that passage. This is the second time that Jesus has told them, I've got to die. I'm sorry, it's the third time. It's the third time when Jesus has told them, we're going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And James and John think, well, okay, that's the way it's got to be. Let's make sure that we get our position in the kingdom. So we let one of us sit on the right hand and one of us sit on the left hand. And then Jesus says to them, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism which I am baptized? And they said to him, we're able. We're able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. Jesus says, are you willing to suffer? You want to be on the right and the left hand? Are you willing to suffer? They said, we are. In our text from Mark chapter 14 that we looked at last week, Peter said to him, even though they all fall away, I'll not. But he said emphatically that he is Peter, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same. Now, look at Peter, James, and John. They've seen Jesus. He's got power over death. They've seen the fact that what glory looks like after suffering. And they all three say, listen, we'll go to the mat. Whatever it takes, however far we have to go, whatever, I'm with you. They had a Rocky Marathon on yesterday. Did anybody know that? A Rocky Marathon on. I like Rocky 5 is okay. 1, 2, and 3 is really good. But they had a Rocky Marathon. And when he's fighting Drago, he has to go to, Drago kills Apollo Creed, and he's going to fight Drago, and he goes to Russia, and he's doing the old-fashioned kind of training, and his wife doesn't want him to fight because his wife has seen Drago kill Apollo Creed in the ring. And so Rocky says, I've got to do this. I'm a fighter by nature. I've got to go do this. And so he's over there training, just Paulie and his trainer over there. And as they're doing that, on one scene, his wife gets there. And his wife says to him, I'm with you no matter what. Meaning, even if you die, I'm going to support you. And Rocky says, no matter what? She says, Peter, James, and John say, no matter what. Jesus says, no matter what? Yeah, no matter what. We're there. We're there. We also see Peter, James, and John, and Andrew's included in this. There is eschatological instruction. In other words, Jesus tells them, This is, in Mark 13, this is what's going to happen, and I am admonishing you, I'm encouraging you to be alert. He says, and as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, when are these things going to happen? And so on and so forth. And Jesus talks to them, and then he says, as we read earlier, it's like a man going on a journey. When he leaves home, he puts his servants in charge, each with his works, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning. He's taught them all these things. He's taught them all the things that and he says, and then he says, and what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. Be alert. Be watchful. All these things that the disciples had done. All the ways in which they said, yeah, Peter, James, and then this is the same Peter, James, and John now, who's seen Jesus' power over death, who's seen His glory, who said, yes, no matter what, we're there with you. We got your back, no matter what. They've heard Jesus tell them about the end times. They've been admonished by Jesus to stay alert. And now He takes these same Peter, James, and John with Him inside the garden to pray with Him. And what do? They do the same thing you and I would have done. They fell asleep. They fell asleep. Mark also in this passage wants to show us that Jesus' 3 sessions of prayer and alertness versus 3 disciples falling asleep 3 times. You see the number 3 in here a lot. 3 disciples falling asleep 3 times. 3 sessions of prayer. And in a few verses later, you're going to have Peter denying Jesus 3 times. And you say, why 3? Old Testament says in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, everything will be confirmed. 2 or 3 witnesses, everything will be confirmed. In other words, we see the disciples not failing once, not failing twice, but 3 times. What's the lesson? Left on your own, when you walk with God in self-confidence, when you try to be a faithful disciple in your own strength, you're going to swing and miss, swing and miss, swing and miss, and maybe you're out. You're out. But we see Jesus 3 times going to the Father and praying and being alert and being faithful and being willing to submit to the Father's will. 3 times. What's that teach us? That Jesus is a faithful disciple. A faithful disciple in times of crisis. You know, as you look at this, Mark has gone to great pains throughout this gospel to show that the disciples who could have been faithful to Jesus, who could have stayed with Jesus in His passion, they could have, but they didn't. They failed to be alert for even an hour and fall asleep. Jesus, on the other hand, is the faithful, who's alert, whereas the 3, they failed to engage in prayer. But Jesus prays, and Jesus prays through a long time. As Jesus prays, they sleep. As Jesus trusts in God, they trust in the flesh. When Jesus remains and is taken away as a prisoner to be tried, they flee. When Jesus is faithful to God and His will for Him, they are faithless. So what's the difference? What's the difference? Why did Jesus remain faithful and the 12 didn't? Well, He's God. You know, that's an easy answer. But you know what? When Jesus lived upon this earth, He divested Himself of all the privileges to act upon His own and submitted Himself to the Father just like every other human being on this earth has to. He submitted Himself to the Holy Spirit just as every other human being has to. When Jesus lived upon this earth, He did not live as the God-man in the sense that, hey, I'm not hungry, it doesn't bother me, I'm God, I don't eat anyways. He was a human being. And as we said earlier, He had to live a life He had to live out the demands of the law and to live out the demands of obedience. In order for him to be sacrificed as the perfect sacrifice, he had to be obedient in everything. He learned submission. Hebrews tells us that he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. That verse fascinates me. That the Son of God had to learn how to obey through his suffering. It's the same thing that fascinates me in Luke, that Jesus grew in stature and in wisdom and in favor with God and in favor with man. How did Jesus do it? And because he did it, and because we are in him as believers, it can be accomplished in our life. How is that done? Two things. Faithfulness and discipleship involves submission to the Father's will. When you look at verses 32 through 36, and we're not going to, I just don't have